It was by accident rather than design that I recently found myself buying and reading 3 editions from the Folio Society, all on the subject of the Holocaust. From left to right here we have If This Is a Man by Primo Levi, we have Schindler's Ark by Thomas Keneally, and we have the Wannsee Conference and the Final Solution by Mark Roseman. And so my plan in coming videos is to review each of these in turn, and I'm going to start with the one here in the middle, which is Schindler's Ark by Thomas Keneally. So it's an edition from the Folio Society, and as usual with folio editions it comes with a slipcase. In this case the slipcase is plain black with a white paper lining. There's nothing terribly remarkable about that, but it's nice to have, of course. And then inside we have this book, which is bound in a grey cloth with a fairly fine weave, almost like linen, and that wraps all the way around onto the backboard of the book here. On the front board though, we have a design in black and gold. We can see running down the left hand side here is a list of names from Schindler's famous list, and we can see them here in black. What may be slightly less clear on the camera is that they also run up to the top of the board in a slightly different shade of gold. And alongside that list we have this figure hunched over a typewriter, no doubt manically typing away to prepare that list. But yes, a very nice, I think, front board design here in black and gilt. And then if we flip over to the spine, we have again in gilt the title Schindler's Ark and the author's name there, Thomas Keneally. Of course, this is a folio edition and the binding is sewn, and we have head and tail bands. They're black, but they're definitely there. Overall then, I think a pretty nice exterior design to the book. If we open it out, we see that we have here custom printed end papers, and in the front end paper we have a map of the Polish city of Krakow, which was the city in which Schindler's first factory, DEF, was based. And we can see here in the suburbs of the city the ghetto in which the Jews were forced to live, were forced to relocate, and it was from this ghetto that the Jews would depart to work here at the German enamelware factory run by Oskar Schindler. Up here is an inset map with a more detailed layout of the ghetto. And then if we flip over to the rear end papers, we have another map, this time of the Plaszow concentration camp, the Plaszow forced labor camp. After the Krakow ghetto was liquidated, the Jews from there were forced to relocate to be internees at this concentration camp under the watchful eye of Hermann Goeth, who was the commandant of the camp. And one of Schindler's first and most important coups was to negotiate with Goeth that he would be allowed to set up a sub-camp at his factory, and so the Schindler Jews, instead of being forced to live and work here within the Plaszow concentration camp, would instead be able to go and stay at Schindler's factory, which was obviously a much more hospitable and much safer environment for them to be in. So those are the end papers. We have the half title, and then we arrive at the title spread, where we see for the first time some important features of the book's design. So here we have the title page, and we can see the title is set in a face called Cable, which was designed by Rudolf Koch, and the rest of the text is set in a face called Imprint. Both of those are typefaces from the early 20th century, so they're period relevant for the setting of this book, which I thought was quite a nice touch. And here we can see the first illustration of the book, but I'm going to come on to illustrations in just a moment's time. So here we see set in imprint with Cable, and we're also told that this is printed, as with most modern Folio Society editions, on Abbey wove paper. So this is acid-free, it's slightly off-white, has a nice smooth texture. If you're used to trade books from the local bookstore, this will be a big upgrade. It's certainly nothing to compete with the very finest of fine books, but a serviceable paper for general reading. And we have an introduction here written by Thomas Keneally, which does a couple of very nice things. So the first is that Keneally recounts how he came to write Schindler's Ark. And that's an interesting story in its own right, because we had this Schindler survivor, a Schindler Jew named Leopold Pfefferberg, who had set up shop quite literally in Beverly Hills. And he'd been spending years telling anybody who would listen about the Schindler story in the hope that somebody would make a book or a movie about that story and spread the word about the good deeds Oskar Schindler had done. A stroke of luck would have it that one day the Australian author Thomas Keneally would walk into Pfefferberg's store and hear the story, and Keneally would become the messenger who would carry that message to the masses. Of course, we know later Spielberg would make a very famous movie, and it's perhaps through that movie that most people came to know of the story. But we really shouldn't downplay Pfefferberg's and Keneally's role in bringing that story to the public's attention. The other thing Keneally does is he gives his own reflections on the deeds of Oskar Schindler, which was also a nice thing to see. And then we get fairly quickly into the book proper. So Keneally's genre of choice is the novel, and so this book is written as if it was a novel. That's an interesting choice because the events that are described, of course, are factual, but the fact that they're presented as a novel makes this very readable. It gives it a pace. It's almost like you're reading some sort of thriller, yet at the same time, you're aware that these are real events of quite some incredible gravity. So we get a look as we leaf through the pages here at the typographic design. It's relatively straightforward. The text is printed not in a huge face, looks like perhaps 11 point at a guess, and quite densely. There's a lot of text to get in here, but I didn't find it at all difficult to read. And the only remarkable thing that we really see is the page numbers set here again in this cable face, and both page numbers on the verso and the recto page are left aligned. So then we should probably skip ahead and take a look at some of these illustrations. So the illustrations are by Tim Lang. They have this realist quality, and they look at first glance like they could almost be black and white photographs from the period. And I think that's quite an interesting choice. Firstly, it gives the illustrations a kind of verite, which I think is appropriate for a book with a subject matter as serious as the subject matter of this book. But also remember, we're reading a book which is factual, but it's presented in the narrative form of a novel. And so somehow it seems appropriate that we have illustrations which are in a fundamentally artistic, painterly medium, and yet nevertheless presented as a facsimile of a photograph, which is a much closer representation of reality. So perhaps I'm reading a little bit too much into that, but I thought that had interesting echoes of Keneally's choice of medium for telling the Schindler story. I thought the illustrations were most appropriate and a very nice complement to the text of the book. Coming on to that text, it's hard to know really where to begin. It's really, of course, a most incredible story. So I considered myself to be reasonably well informed. I was struck just how many extra dimensions to the story there were to be told in the book, first of all. But more than that, by how powerful a book can be in telling that sort of story, because the book, unlike the movie, can really encourage us to pause and reflect on the thoughts and the feelings of the characters that were described. And I should say the book also pulled no punches in describing the brutality of some of the events that unfolded. I mean, the movie was not exactly a happy one, but the book really goes to the next level. I found it quite shocking in places. But in a positive way, I really felt like, it may sound trite, but I'm a better human being for having read this important book. So I'd encourage everybody to take a look at it. So very fond not only of the overall design, the presentation, Tim Lang's illustrations I think are great, but also Thomas Keneally's writing here. I think Pfefferberg really found the right author for this book. Keneally was definitely the man to bring this story to the masses, and I'm very grateful for having read the book. So thumbs up for me for this particular Folio Society edition. As I said, this is one of 3 books about the Holocaust that I've read. I'll be coming to the others later, and some of these are also powerful in a different but quite striking way. In fact, one of these books perhaps is the most moving book I read in my lifetime. So if you're interested in hearing more about those, do subscribe to the channel and they'll be posted in due course.